Welcome to the deep dive. We are so glad you are here with us today because today we're tackling something that really challenges how we think about everyday medicine. Usually when we talk about a medical treatment, there's this underlying expectation of, well, mathematical precision.
Right, yeah, like basic arithmetic.
Exactly. We are totally conditioned to think that way. You take one pill, you get a certain effect. You take two pills, you get twice the effect. The relationship feels very linear, very clean, and frankly, very intuitive.
It is a really comforting model. I mean, we want the chemistry inside our bodies to behave like a straightforward staircase. We just assume the biological response will always remain perfectly proportional to the physical dose we hold in our hands.
But the moment you step into the world of psychiatry, or really neurobiology in general, that simple arithmetic just completely shatters.
Oh, it falls apart entirely.
Yeah, we are actually looking at a pharmacological landscape that operates on a totally different kind of geometry. So today, our deep dive is focusing on this fascinating piece of source material. It's a 2026 clinical protocol published by the PsychNP Fellowship, and it's all about the science of something called hyperbolic tapering.
Which is such a massive shift in how we approach care.
It really is. So our mission today is to uncover this mystery that has basically plagued patients and doctors for decades. We are going to explore exactly why stopping antidepressants has historically been such a painful and often failed process for so many people. And we'll see how a radical shift in the math, like actually matching the medication taper to the true biology of the human brain, is fundamentally changing those outcomes.
And the stakes here, I mean, they've moved way beyond just some academic debate. Just to set the context for you, in May 2026, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, the HHS, they actually published a major action plan specifically targeting appropriate psychiatric prescribing.
Wow, so the federal government got involved?
Yeah. They made deprescribing a massive federal focus area. Organizations like PMHNP are actively out there rolling out clinician webinars just to retrain the entire workforce.
The traditional way of stopping these medications isn't just, frustrating anymore. It has been officially recognized as dangerously outdated.
Right. So whether you are currently taking a daily medication yourself, or maybe you know a friend who has struggled to stop taking one, or even if you're just fascinated by how established medical consensus suddenly evolves overnight, this material is a massive aha moment.
It really is.
To understand this new 2026 protocol, we really have to look closely at the mechanical failure of the old method. So let's start with a pretty shocking piece of data from the source. If you take a standard 20 milligram paroxetine pill, right, and you tell a patient to just cut it in half to stop taking it, a third of those patients become dizzy within a week.
Which sounds crazy, right? Because basic arithmetic tells us that half the pill should mean half the effect.
Exactly. But the math in the pharmacy clearly doesn't translate to the math in the brain. No, it doesn't. And this brings us to some really groundbreaking 2019 PTT scan data from researchers Horowitz and Taylor. This was published in The Lancet Psychiatry, and they physically mapped out the brains of patients on these medications.
Okay, so what did they actually find?
Well, they proved that serotonin transporter occupancy, which is basically the percentage of receptors in the brain that are actually bound to the drug, is hyperbolic. It is a steep curve. It's not a straight line.
Okay, let's unpack this. We know a hyperbolic curve means the numbers fall off a cliff at the very end, but I really want to understand the actual neurobiology here. Why do the receptors behave this way?
Well, think of the brain's receptors like a game of musical chairs.
Okay, musical chairs.
Yeah, it's a perfect way to visualize it. Imagine you have 100 chairs. Those are the serotonin receptors in your brain. Now, a standard 20 milligram dose of an antidepressant is like sending 1,000 kids into the room when the music stops.
Oh, wow. That is a lot of kids for 100 chairs.
Exactly. There's this overwhelming surplus of drug molecules. And because the drug has an incredibly high binding affinity, every single chair gets filled immediately. The receptors are completely saturated.
Right. So if you cut the dose in half, you drop down to 10 milligrams. Following the analogy, you've just cut the number of kids from 1,000 down to 500.
But there are still only 100 chairs. The room is still completely flooded.
Ah, I see.
So dropping from 20 milligrams to 10 milligrams barely even registers in the brain. The Horowitz and Taylor data showed that 20 milligrams of citalopram occupies about 80% of your serotonin receptors. If you have the physical dose to 10 milligrams, the biological effect doesn't drop to 40%.
Let me guess, it barely moves.
Right. It only drops by about 5 percentage points down to 75%.
That is wild.
Yeah.
You literally cut the physical pill in half, but your brain is still operating at nearly full drug capacity.
Yeah. But consider what happens at the very end of the game, right? Once you get down to, say, 5 milligrams, you might only have 100 kids for 100 chairs. Now, every single reduction actually matters.
Because now chairs are actually going empty?
Exactly. Dropping from 5 milligrams to 2.5 milligrams drops the biological effect by a massive 20 percentage points. We have literally spent decades treating this biological saturation curve like a simple staircase. The first few milligram cuts feel completely fine to the patient, but those last few milligrams—
That's the cliff.
that is the cliff. That's when the chairs suddenly go empty and these massive biological shifts happen.
The last steps are the steepest biologically, even though physically the pill looks exactly the same.
Right.
So if the biology of the brain is this steep exponential curve, then the protocol must force the mathematical schedule to, match that curve.
Right. Yes. That is the core innovation of the 2026 protocol. It introduces this concept of hyperbolic tapering. Instead of dropping the medication by fixed, flat milligrams, like subtracting 5 milligrams every single month, the patient reduces the medication by 10% of their current dose.
Okay, the current dose, not the starting dose.
Right, exactly. So if you were at a 2 milligram dose, your next step is a reduction of 10% of 2, which brings you down to 1.8 milligrams.
Okay, and then 4 weeks later, you calculate 10% of 1.8, bringing you to 1.62 milligrams, then roughly 1.4, and so on.
You got it. The physical dose reduction gets gentler and gentler exactly as the biological drop gets steeper. If you plotted it out on a graph, this 10% dosing schedule looks like the exact mathematical inverse of the brain's receptor occupancy.
It neutralizes the cliff.
It neutralizes the cliff.
But looking at these fractions of a milligram, stepping down by these microscopic amounts every month, it introduces a massive trade-off, doesn't it? Time. I mean, the Maudsley deprescribing guidelines referenced in the source state, this takes 6 to 18 months.
Yeah, it's not quick.
Not weeks, but up to a year and a half to come off a daily medication. That feels like a huge commitment.
The cost is absolutely duration. There's no getting around that. But retrospective cohorts using this hyperbolic method are showing a 70% success rate in discontinuation.
Wow, 70%.
Yeah, that level of success simply did not exist with the old linear tapers. Patients are basically trading a fast timeline for a functional, pain-free life during the process.
I do want to push back on the math here, though. Let's talk about Zeno's paradox from high school geometry.
Oh, right.
Because if you keep reducing a number by 10% of whatever the current value is, mathematically, you never actually reach zero. You just get infinitely smaller fractions, 0.1, 0.01.
Right.
So how do you actually finish the paper? You can't just taper forever.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
And the protocol writers recognize that infinite loop. You don't taper into eternity.
Yeah.
The Maudsley guidelines established a really specific endpoint rule.
Okay, what is it?
You continue the 10% hyperbolic taper until your daily dose reaches roughly 1/40th of the original therapeutic dose. For a standard drug like citalopram, that lands somewhere around 0.5 milligrams.
Right.
Once you hit that threshold, you just stop entirely.
But why 1/40th? Does the brain just suddenly stop caring at 0.5 milligrams? What is biologically happening at that specific threshold that makes it safe to finally just jump off?
Well, it comes back to that receptor saturation curve we talked about earlier. At roughly 1/40th of a starting dose, the receptor occupancy drops down to about 2 or 3%.
Oh, okay. So it's barely there.
Right.
Yeah.
At that level, the drug's effect is essentially drowned out by the natural background noise of your brain's own fluctuating serotonin levels. The exogenous chemical is no longer carrying the load, so removing it completely doesn't trigger this huge alarm bell in the nervous system.
That makes a lot of sense.
But, this is crucial, the source strongly emphasizes that navigating down to that 1/40th mark is the most critical part of the entire journey.
The most critical part.
Yes. Patients who get impatient at, say, 2 milligrams, who say, hey, I've come this far, I feel fine, I'm just going to stop, they routinely show up in the clinic 3 weeks later in full agonizing withdrawal.
Because at 2 milligrams, they still have significant receptor occupancy.
Exactly.
They just blindly stepped off the very cliff we were trying to avoid.
Yeah, they jumped.
Which brings up a question that I think is really at the heart of this entire document. If these linear, straightforward tapers were causing all these violent cliff drops at the end, why didn't the medical community realize the math was wrong earlier? Why did prescribers keep using the old method for decades if patients were crashing so hard?
We are getting into what might be the great misdiagnosis of modern psychiatry here. The entire field spent decades systematically conflating two entirely different phenomena.
Okay.
They confuse discontinuation symptoms with a relapse of the original illness.
Let's clearly define those two things for you listening, because our sources draw a very sharp line between them. So, let's look at discontinuation symptoms first. These are the physiological reactions to the drug rapidly vacating the body. They emerge quickly, right?
Very quickly, usually within 1 to 7 days of a dose reduction.
And the symptoms are highly physical. We're talking dizziness, flu-like malaise, severe nausea, and something patients refer to as brain zaps.
Oh, the brain zaps, yeah.
These highly disorienting electric shock sensations just firing off inside the skull.
And critically, discontinuation symptoms resolve almost immediately if the prior dose of the medication is reinstated.
It's just straight up withdrawal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A 2024 Lancet meta-analysis looked really closely at this phenomenon. They found an incidence of discontinuation symptoms in roughly 15% of all tapering patients, with about 3% categorized as severe. It is a biological withdrawal syndrome.
Right. But then you contrast that with a true relapse, and it's totally different. Relapse emerges on a much longer timeline, typically weeks or even months after a dose change. And a true relapse reproduces the original psychological symptoms that the patient sought treatment for initially.
Right. The core depression, the pervasive anxiety.
But without those bizarre physical, somatic, flu-like features. And furthermore, if you reinstate the drug during a relapse, the patient does not bounce back in a matter of hours.
No, not at all. It takes weeks for the medication to build back up and actually exert a therapeutic effect again.
They look completely different on a timeline, and they feel completely different to the patient, assuming the clinician takes a careful, nuanced history.
Which hasn't always happened.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's map this out with a hypothetical patient to see the trap in action. Imagine a patient, let's call her Sarah. She's been on 10 milligrams of medication for 5 years. She feels great, and she wants to stop. Her doctor tells her to cut the pill in half to 5 milligrams.
Okay, the standard old advice.
3 days later, the room is spinning, she's sweating, and she's getting these electric brain zaps. She is terrified. She goes back to the clinic, and the doctor looks at her distress and says, your anxiety and depression are back. You clearly can't function without this medication. The doctor puts her back on the drug, maybe even at a higher dose, and she feels better by dinner time.
Which completely reinforces the doctor's incorrect assumption.
Exactly.
The rapid relief proves to the prescriber that Sarah, quote-unquote, needs the drug, when in reality, the rapid relief just proves she was experiencing chemical withdrawal. We basically created a false, self-fulfilling narrative of lifelong dependency, entirely because the reduction increment was just too steep for the receptors to handle.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the truly tragic part is that the patient internalizes this as a personal failure. They think their brain is just permanently broken.
Yeah, they blame themselves. Lindsay Hill, the founder of the PsychNP Fellowship, she captures this perfectly in the 2026 material. She says, the assumption that the medication can be stopped the same way it was started is the fundamental error of the last 20 years.
Wow.
When a patient crashes at the tail end of a standard linear taper, it looks exactly like a psychological treatment failure. But it's not. It is a pharmacology problem created entirely by the geometry of the prescriber's schedule.
The patient didn't fail. The math failed.
Exactly.
Knowing the geometry and understanding this diagnostic trap changes the entire paradigm. But practically speaking, I am completely stuck on the logistics here. How on earth does a patient sitting at their kitchen table divide a tiny, solid, chalky pill into exactly a 1.62 milligram dose?
Oh, it's impossible. And that logistical bottleneck is exactly why this protocol took so long to become standard practice. You absolutely cannot rely on a patient hacking away at a tablet with a kitchen knife or, opening up a capsule to count 50 microscopic beads.
Oh my gosh, counting beads.
It is highly imprecise, and frankly, it is incredibly anxiety-inducing for someone who is already worried about going into withdrawal.
Right. I bumped the table, half the powder fell on the floor, and now my brain chemistry is going to crash.
Exactly. And the anxiety alone can mimic withdrawal symptoms. So the workhorses of this 2026 protocol are entirely different delivery systems. We are talking about commercial liquid formulations that could be measured with microsyringes.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, and custom compounded suspensions created by specialty pharmacies. And my favorite, these specialized tapering strips from places like the Netherlands that package exact, decreasing microdoses into these day-by-day blister packs. The patient isn't doing the math, the pharmacist is.
But the source outlines that the difficulty of using these tools varies wildly depending on which specific drug you are actually talking about. And it largely comes down to a concept called half-life, right? Which is how long it takes for the body to clear half the drug from the bloodstream. Let's break down the difficulty tiers here.
Sure. At the very top of the difficulty list, the absolute hardest to taper is paroxetine. It has a notoriously short half-life of about 21 hours.
Oh.
That means it vacates the body rapidly, violently pulling the rug out from under those serotonin receptors. But it also has high anticholinergic activity, which adds a whole second layer of withdrawal.
Okay, I need to stop you there. Anticholinergic activity sounds like serious textbook jargon. What does that actually mean for the patient trying to taper at home?
Good question. It refers to the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which largely regulates your parasympathetic nervous system. That's your rest and digest functions,
Right.
like your heart rate, your digestion, salivation.
Okay.
Paroxetine blocks these receptors. Over time, the body adapts to that blockade. When you suddenly remove the paroxetine, the acetylcholine system is basically flooded, and that causes rebound physical chaos.
Like what?
Severe nausea, sweating, insomnia, massive gastrointestinal distress. So, with paroxetine, the patient is fighting a war on two fronts: serotonin withdrawal and acetylcholine rebound. And to make matters worse, the smallest commercial pill available is 10 milligrams, which is just massive.
It's a chemical nightmare for a taper. The source also lumps venlafaxine and duloxetine into this very hard category due to short half-lives and capsules that are practically booby-trapped against microdosing. Okay, so those are the hardest. What's on the other end of the spectrum?
Fluoxetine is widely considered the easiest.
Really? Why?
The reason is fascinating. When your liver processes fluoxetine, it produces an active metabolite called norfluoxetine. This metabolite stays in the bloodstream and continues acting on the brain, but its half-life isn't measured in hours. It is measured in weeks.
Wait, so even after you stop taking the pill, the drug is still technically floating around in there doing the work?
Yes. As you lower the physical dose, that long-acting metabolite acts like a built-in self-tapering cushion. It slowly, organically coasts out of your system over a month, drastically softening the landing for those receptors.
So what does this all mean for standard practices? Can't doctors just switch everyone to fluoxetine at the end to make it easy? Use it as a bridge.
You would think so, but the protocol explicitly warns against relying on the fluoxetine bridge as a routine shortcut.
Why not, if it solves the half-life problem?
Because antidepressants are not just interchangeable serotonin juice. Each drug has a highly specific, complex affinity for different receptors. Some touch dopamine, some touch norepinephrine, some touch histamine.
Oh, I see.
Swapping a patient from paroxetine to fluoxetine is like swapping a Windows computer for a Mac. Yes, they both browse the internet, but the underlying operating system is entirely different. You risk severely destabilizing a brain that has been comfortably adapted to one specific chemical environment for years. The bridge is a tool of absolute last resort for extreme cases, not just a convenient default.
You cannot just swap the chemical environment and expect the nervous system to not notice. Which leads to another crucial practical rule from the source material, which is that the calendar should never drive the taper.
Exactly. The 2026 protocol is adamant that a taper is a biological process. It is not a corporate deliverable with a hard deadline. If the mathematical schedule says, reduce the dose every 4 weeks, but the patient reaches week 3 and feels dizzy, nauseous, or starts getting those brain zaps.
You don't push through the pain just to check a box on a calendar.
No, you hold the step. You wait until the nervous system stabilizes and the symptoms resolve, even if that pause adds 3 months to the total timeline. You have to let the biology dictate the pace, not the prescription pad.
Wow. Let's synthesize this whole journey we've been on today. We started with the basic assumption that medical dosing is linear, a straight staircase where 1 milligram equals 1 unit of effect. But the realization that the brain's receptors actually operate on a steep, exponential saturation curve fundamentally changes the math of deprescribing. It means successfully coming off these medications requires hyperbolic geometry, it requires custom liquid formulations to achieve microdoses, and above all, it requires immense biology-led patience.
We are talking about a timeline of seasons, not weeks.
Right.
And for you listening, understanding the mechanics of this protocol is incredibly empowering. Whether you are advocating for yourself in a doctor's office or maybe supporting a family member who is terrified to step down their dose, knowing the critical mechanical difference between a psychological relapse and a biological discontinuation symptom changes the entire conversation you have with a prescriber. It moves you from feeling broken and dependent to feeling scientifically informed.
It flips the script entirely. The failure was in the geometry, not the patient. Which leaves us with a final thought for you to ponder long after we wrap up today.
Oh, I like this.
If standard medical practice spent decades treating an exponential, highly sensitive biological curve as a flat, linear line in psychiatry, what other daily medications for our blood pressure, our digestion, or our sleep might we be starting or stopping with the completely wrong mathematical geometry?
It certainly invites a healthy skepticism about the blind spots still hiding in our medicine cabinets, doesn't it?
We will leave you with that question to explore on your own. Thanks for joining us for the deep dive. Catch you next time.